It started subtly, almost too subtle to notice. Max, Sarah and Tom's golden retriever had always been the perfect companion, obedient, loyal and affectionate. He greeted them every morning with a wagging tail, his soft brown eyes always sparkling with warmth. But recently, something about Max had changed. It was barely perceivable at first. The way he'd stare at nothing, his ears twitching as if listening to a sound only he could hear, or the way he'd growl in his sleep, deep and low, unlike anything they'd heard before. And then the sneaking began. At first they assumed he just wanted to stretch his legs at night. They'd hear the faint creak of the front door and the soft pad, the pad of paws on the hardened wood floor. As he slipped outside when Max returned, it was usually just before dawn, covered in dirt with wild eyes and a panting smile. Sarah laughed it off, saying he was just probably chasing rabbits. But after a few nights, they couldn't ignore it anymore. Max's once luminous fur had grown dull, patches of it matted with grime, and his eyes, those warm, comforting eyes, seemed darker. His gaze, when he looked at them, felt calculating, cold. Tom began locking the front door before bed, only to wake up and find it ajar, as if Max had found a way to unlock it himself. Then the murders started. At first, the killings were whispered about by neighbors, brutal, savage attacks that left bodies torn open, throats shredded, and faces frozen in unspeakable terror. The police had no suspects, no clues. The victims had no connections to one another, except for the sheer violence inflicted upon them. Sarah and Tom tried to push the thought out of their minds, but it gnawed at them, festering like a dark seed of doubt, especially when they started walking up to muddy paw prints inside the house, tracking through the kitchen and leading to the front door. They hadn't let Max out that night. How did he get out? One evening, after weeks of mounting fear, Sarah decided they needed to know for sure. She insisted they follow Max. Tom was reluctant. Something about the idea filled him with dread, but Sarah's resolve was stronger. That night they pretended to sleep, lying stiff in the bed, waiting for the creak of the door. It came around 2 a.m. They'd followed Max into the night, moving silently as his golden fur glowed faintly under the moonlight. They watched as he trotted through the streets, further than he'd ever gone before, deeper into the decaying part of town no one visited anymore. Max led them to a house they thought had long been abandoned, a sagging, crooked structure barely standing from the street. They could see light flickering in the windows, like candle flames dancing inside. Max disappeared through the open doorway without hesitation. Their skin prickled as they stepped inside. The air was icy, the walls thick with rotten mold. As they walked deeper into the house, they noticed something scattered across the floor. Piles of bones, some cracked, some gnawed, all human. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, but Tom's eyes were fixed on Max. There in the center of the room was their dog, but Max wasn't alone. Figures loomed around him, twisted shadows with hollow staring eyes. They weren't quite human, their skin long loose, their limbs elongated, their faces blank and featureless, save for wide lipless grins. And Max, he sat among them, his posture unnaturally rigid, his eyes reflecting something darker than a dog's thoughts should ever hold. One of the figures stepped forward, reaching a bony hand to Max, stroking his fur. It whispered, his voice a rasp that made Sarah's skin crawl.
"You've done well."
Max lifted his head, slowly turning towards Tom and Sarah. His eyes had fully changed black now, endless pools of malice. His mouth twisted into something that could only be described as a smile, revealing teeth far sharper than any dog should have. Then came the voice.
"You were never meant to follow me."
Before Tom or Sarah could react, Max lunged. His body moved in ways no dog should. His spine twisted unnaturally, limbs bending like a broken marionette. His jaws clamped down on Tom's leg. The scream that escaped Tom's lips was choked off as Max tore into him, a frenzy of snarling and flesh ripping that echoed through the house. Sarah scrambled backwards, tears blurring her vision as she tried to run, but the shadows, they moved, They crawled along the walls, slithering like smoke surrounding her. Cold hands reached out, caressing her skin with a deathly chill. The last thing she saw before everything went black was Max standing over what remained of Tom, his fur drenched in blood, his eyes locking onto hers with that chilling, inhuman smile. The next morning, Max was back home. He lay on the front porch, his fur clean, eyes warm and innocent once again. His tail wagged lazily as the sun rose. When the police arrived later that day, they found Sarah and Tom's mangled bodies in the old house, just like the other brutally murdered. Faces twisted in horror, but there was no sign of a killer, no trace of who or what could have done such a thing. Max tilted his head as one of the officers scratched behind his ears, muttering, "What a good boy." The dog's mouth open in a panting grin. Inside, in the darkness of his soul, the killer waited for night to fall once again.